Liturgy. Tonight we will begin with the Quotidian of St. Basil. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Your voice resounded throughout the world, that received your word, by which in godly manner you taught dogma, clarified nature of divine beings, and set in order the character of people. Venerable Father, royal priesthood, intercede with Christ our God to grant us his great mercy. Amen.
Amen. George, can you see that?
Tonight's class is entitled Sacred Space, Architecture, and Iconography. I'm going to give a few disclaimers before we jump in tonight. When we get later into the church's architecture, we're only going to be speaking about the Greek tradition. It's too vast to speak about the development of the iconostasis in the Slavic traditions, or the exterior icons in Romania, and every ethnic and cultural group has their own specific adaptations of the church space and decoration. And it's just easier for us to stay with the Greek because we are a Greek Orthodox parish, but also this is where we see the trends develop first, and then these trends are then interpreted within their cultural milieu. So this really lays the foundation for that which is adopted and shaped by later cultural spaces. As we talk about iconography, this is not going to be a whole exposition about the theology of the icon in the Orthodox Church, but since it's a study of the Divine Liturgy, we'll be talking about how the liturgy affected iconography and how iconography affected the liturgy. Same thing with architecture. We're not going to spend so much time talking about all of the different features of the different eras. We're going to talk about what affected the liturgy and what was affected by the liturgy. We'll give an overview, but we could spend an entire 6-week course just on Hagia Sophia. So in order for us to do it in one, we need to move a little quickly. But that's those are my disclaimers for tonight. So the topics and the areas that we're going to study are the Roman house church, the Roman Basilica, the early Byzantine period. I'm going to use as our example for this Hagia Sophia because it is the greatest example. It does have a very unique place within the church. Then we're going to talk about post-iconoclasm, and then finish with iconography of the liturgy. As we go through, I'll talk about iconography as they pertain to each particular time period and structure, and then at the end we'll talk about how the liturgy is depicted in iconography. So if you remember back to our discussion of the development of the Roman house church through the Byzantine period and all the things that we discussed during our last meeting where we talked about the history and development, you remember that the early Christians, before they had their buildings, their own buildings, met in homes. And so we see this even as early as the New Testament, where St. Paul in his epistle to the Romans writes, and he says, Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Jesus Christ, who have risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets in their house. This means that Prisca and Aquila had within their home was the location of the Christian gathering for the people. So, a typical Mediterranean home is the first church that we have. It would have an outer courtyard, an inner courtyard, and then various rooms off of that. At first, these homes serve the function of actually being a home, and then people gathering there for the Divine Liturgy. As time goes on, in late 2nd, early 3rd century, people start to build or co-opt homes and make them into churches before they have access to public buildings. So you, in the early years, have a home where people are living every day, that they invite the community into their home for worship. Then, over time, they either take abandoned homes or a home that was left in a will, and they convert that home into a specific worship space. But there is no difference between where you lived your daily life, where you interacted with your family, and where you worshiped the Lord, and where you met for the Divine Liturgy. So one of the examples of the later period is a city in Syria called Dura Europos, which was discovered not too long ago. In this city, there are two important religious structures. The first and more famous is a synagogue, and the synagogue in Dura Europos has some of the earliest frescoes we see in a Jewish place of worship. That sounds strange to our ears because we understand that the Jewish law forbade the use of images, but the synagogue in Dura Europos was more ordained, more decorated with iconography, if we can call it that, than the church itself was. More scholarship is done on that because it's a bigger, more elaborate structure, but the church at Dura Europos, like I said, it's a 3rd century church in Syria that was originally a home that was converted entirely to a worship space. So no longer did it have a family living within it, but it had, it was used specifically for Christian worship. The church also had frescoes, like I said, not as many as the synagogue, but some of the main frescoes are a fresco of the Good Shepherd, the myrrh-bearing women, and the healing of the paralytic. There are a couple of others I wanted to show you, but they're rough. So this image we have right here is the baptistry section of the house church at Dura Europos. So you can see right here, this is the baptismal font with the arch over it. In that arch right there is the icon of the Good Shepherd. Right here you can see 2 of the women. There's a 3rd here who that fresco no longer survived. Coming to the tomb of Christ, these are the myrrh-bearing women. Up here we also have, this is an icon of Christ and Peter walking on water. And then on the other side of the room is where you have the healing of the paralytic and some of the others. So this is like a typical Roman home decorated with frescoes. So the iconography of the time matches the style and the art of the period. You can think of the ruins of Pompeii and how those homes are all richly decorated inside with frescoes. The house church at Dura Europos had the same. Here's a schematic of what that house church looked like. So here you have the entrance and then the interior courtyard. You go up the steps and there's the baptistry that we were just looking at with the arch, the baptismal font, and here are those frescoes. This room was specifically for teaching and education, and this, the assembly room, if you remember back to our discussion from the 2nd week, where Father Alexander Schmemann speaks about the liturgy of assembly. The liturgy is a coming together of people. This room that is designated as the room, the assembly room, this is where the meal would be celebrated and the Divine Liturgy or the Eucharist would be had. Again, remember that when we spoke last week, at this time period, there was still a meal associated with the celebration of the Divine Liturgy. So as you came together, you would be taught. This would be where the catechumens are instructed. And then here, you would gather for your meal, within which you would bless bread and wine, and that would be distributed to all as the Eucharist. But we should remember from last week that this really did involve a full meal. So this is what a typical worship space in the 1st through 3rd century looked like in the Roman world. Any questions about the house church before we move on to the next area? Yeah, Nancy?
Father, that looks like a pretty large house. Was this wealthy people that had these homes, or was this doesn't look like a peasant's house?
Yes, and you're correct. It is. It is the home of a wealthy person. Like I said, this has been converted. So you have to understand that this specific church has like we do now, the financial support of the entire community supporting that one structure. Now we have, you're not all providing, liturgies in your home, you're supporting our parish and our church. So at Dura Europos, the people there were supporting this building. But in earlier times in Rome, the practice in Rome was that a rich patron would make their home available for the celebration of the Eucharist, for instruction and teaching. They would actually be the patron of a particular preacher or priest. This kind of goes contrary to what we think of in the early Roman period. In Rome, there was not one bishop, and the role of bishop and priest was kind of fuzzy at that point in time. Priests don't get their own distinct role until much later. But at Rome, the situation you have is essentially the same situation that they used for the education of their children. So you have a wealthy landowner, a wealthy homeowner who would provide not only lodging but space for their teacher to educate their children. Then within their home, that teacher would work, function, and educate their children as an extension of the family. This same structure of a patronage is what existed in the early church. As we read about Hippolytus last time, we spoke about the liturgy in Rome during his time. Hippolytus gives evidence to like 2 or 3 different communities that met at different places. This ultimately led to some conflict, and then the rise of, and we'll go there, the rise of what's called the monepiscopate in Rome, which is the one bishop, and that becomes standard. That's a situation that's kind of unique to Rome because they had that system of patronage being the capital of the empire. So yes, these house churches were inevitably and could not function without wealthy patrons. George.
Can you go back?
Sure.
Can you point out where the altar is?
So as a meal, the altar would be the table on which they serve. There is not a fixed altar here in the house church. You have your table set up, and that's it. This helps us develop into what we have in the church now, just a piece of cloth called the andimension, which is a little rectangular piece of cloth that on it has an icon of Christ's burial, and that is open on the altar table before every Divine Liturgy. It serves many, many functions. The history of this particular thing is too complex for us to go into, but it comes out of this need, that they needed to put something down. It's essentially a tablecloth. And they would use that same tablecloth, and not only when they had services within the house church, but another location that I didn't include for the Divine Liturgy or the celebration of the Eucharist in the early Roman imperial period is the catacombs and the tombs of the martyrs. So they would take this special tablecloth and put it down over the tomb, the marble slabs or the coves, the alcoves in the walls of the catechumens, and they would celebrate the Divine Liturgy upon the tombs of the martyrs. That's where we get the tradition of putting the relics of martyrs into the consecrated altar table. We are still on a consecrated table celebrating the Divine Liturgy on the relics of a martyr, and it must be a martyr for consecration. Now you've got me on a roll, so that that piece of cloth not only serves as a tablecloth, but in a period of time when you didn't have ready access to tombs of martyrs, they would sew into that the bones, the relics of the martyr. And so if you were traveling from one place to another, you would bring that cloth with you, and it didn't only serve as a tablecloth, but it sanctified whatever surface you were celebrating upon. Because you open up this cloth, within it are the bones of the martyr, you set it down upon a table, and now there you go, you've got a tomb of a martyr right there. We no longer, if table, if an altar is consecrated, it's no longer necessary to have those relics within the antimunción. And to be honest, I know parishes that are not consecrated, and I don't believe that their antimunción still has relics in it. I don't know what you do about that, but I'm gonna move off the antimunción because I could go a lot longer. Like I said, so this is the early Roman period. The Christians in the Mediterranean world are meeting in homes, and they're meeting in homes because they're not publicly welcome yet. There is persecution after persecution, some varying levels of tolerance, but to worship out in a public space is to call attention to yourself, which is to invite persecution. And while the church didn't shy away from the opportunity to confess Christ, the church also wasn't going out looking to get people killed in order to profess Christ. If the opportunity presented itself, they stood strong in their faith, but they didn't go out looking for martyrdom and actually cautioned against it. So they met in private. As the Roman Empire becomes more Christian, and as toleration for Christianity comes to an imperial policy with St. Constantine, we move out of the house and into the Roman Basilica. This is an example of the old St. Peter's Basilica, and we'll talk about that. So a basilica really is just a Roman assembly room. It's a multi-purpose building. You have court, legal cases are argued there, general assemblies, elections, anything that required the citizens of a city to assemble would take place in a basilica. So as the Orthodox, or as the church begins to move out of homes and is looking for places to assemble, they move into basilicas, and they take over either abandoned or they receive the blessing of the magistrate to co-opt and take on an existing Roman basilica. And then once they're in basilicas and they start to build their own churches, they build them in the basilica style. It really is just a Roman multi-purpose building. But it has some key features. Those features are the nave, and we'll look at a schematic later. The nave, aisles, and an apse, and maybe a transept. So the nave is the center body of the church. The aisles would be on either side, so you see how this roof is elevated. It's 2 stories. On the sides, you would have a 1-story aisle, and those would be separated by a colonnade. The nave is the center. The aisles obviously are on the side. You'd have a courtyard, and then here, this cross piece is called the transept. Some of them have them, some basilicas do, some don't. It's not uncommon to find basilicas that are just straight rectangular buildings, but we tend to think of churches as having a cross shape that comes out of this Roman transept that's inherent in a good portion. It's not uncommon to see a Roman basilica that's not a church that represents the shape of a cross. So it's very easy for a church to move in and see within it God's providence in providing the toleration of the Roman Empire and the availability of these buildings that are already in the shape of a cross. It just invites Christian worship into their place. I said Old St. Peter's right here, and then St. Apollinaris in class, which is in Ravenna, is another example of a basilica. That church does not have a transept, so you can see what it looks like that way. And then the Church of the Nativity that was built by St. Helen in Jerusalem is also a basilica style. So the early churches that were built by Constantine and his mother, and the early church after its toleration are all these basilica-style churches. The shape will change in time, but right now it's this assembly place. And as you, like I said before, if you think back to what Father Alexander Schmemann said, it makes sense for the church not to create new buildings, but with the understanding that the Divine Liturgy is the assembly, the coming together of the community, then moving into buildings and spaces that already have that understanding to them makes it very easy for your theology to be present in the buildings you choose to worship. So they chose not to continue to worship in houses. They chose not to worship in forums or outside. They chose not to continue to worship in catacombs. But because of their understanding that the Divine Liturgy is the coming together of all the people, they move into the building that's designated for public assembly. So here you see the theology, the understanding of the Divine Liturgy dictating the architecture that the church uses for its worship. So here is an example. Here's, again, this is the old St. Peter's, before obviously the one that we all know now. So here's the atrium, the narthex. The nave, like I said, is this long centerpiece, and the two side aisles, you can see it here. There's the colonnade that separates the aisle from the nave. The apse is in the back of the church right here. You'll get a better view of it when we go to St. Apollinaris and see what that church looks like. But in the apse would sit, during the imperial time, before these became churches, would sit the judge or the magistrate, the person of importance. There would be a throne there in the back in the apse. So George was asking before, in the house church, where is the altar? As you have the seat of power in the apse of the basilica, when you move into the basilica, you take out that seat and you replace it with the altar table. So going on, just to give you another example, this is St. Apollinaris in Ravenna. You can see very clearly what we're talking about here. So this is the large center nave, and there are the two side aisles. You can see, just like that last picture, it's got a pitched roof that's supported by wood supports, and then there, this circular part in the back is the apse, and this right here is the altar table. Now, the throne that's there doesn't entirely go away, it just moves further back behind the altar table, but as the throne is pushed back, the altar table replaces the throne there. But we still retain the throne. So, Old St. Peter's was built by the Emperor Constantine. This church was built much later, into the 6th century. So you'll see that the basilica maintains its position, especially in the west, as the main liturgical worship space. And part of that is because the west doesn't have the same liturgical actions happening that will happen in the east. When we talk about Hagia Sophia, we will talk about how the liturgy shaped the structure a little bit more and see the difference between the basilica and what becomes Hagia Sophia. But I want you to note something, and we'll see it again in Hagia Sophia. There's still rich iconography in the basilica, but notice where it's placed. So in the early pre-iconoclastic period, the main focus of iconography is the apse. So here you actually have St. Apollinaris, and there he is the shepherd of Ravenna, and so you have his flock. There you have a large cross. That will be picked up later by iconoclasts and used in their art. But you have, the main focus is the apse, and then along the sides you see here different icons of saints, bishops, and whatnot. It's all on the upper level. So there is no iconography on the walls at the lower level where people can actually interact with it in the way that we currently interact with icons through veneration and things like that. So all the iconography is placed on the upper level. We're going to move now into Hagia Sophia and talk about how that church developed as a result of the Divine Liturgy and how it shaped the Divine Liturgy. But before I do, any questions about the Basilica style? John?
Pre-Christian, what was the purpose of the transept?
Space. Just bringing in more people, I think. I'm not entirely sure.
It's kind of up there.
It's not up. It's It's on the same level, but it's creates a cross pattern. There aren't in the Basilica second level galleries. So here you have one level church. So it's everybody who's in church for the liturgy, they're all here in this space. There is no second level. So this, above this line you see right here with the iconography where the windows are, that is the second story of the Basilica. That is typical of the nave. The nave is 2 stories, but the aisles are just 1 story. That's it. So there is no gallery section to a basilica so that you could overlook the services itself. So everybody's on the same. Yeah, George.
How many worshipers would come usually, and was the meal still part of this because there's no tables?
No, there is. I can't answer how many people would come. I just don't know. But by this point in time, we're talking about the 4th century. We're talking about the legalization of Christianity, and by this period, the meal has separated from the Eucharist for at least 100 years, maybe more in some areas, maybe less, but approximately 100 years. We've got Cyprian of Carthage, who's writing in the 2nd century, talking about how they no longer celebrate the service in the evening because not everyone can get there, so it's in the morning. You've got Tertullian, who's a little bit before that, I'm sorry, a little bit after that, but still in the 2nd century, and he's talking about, oh no, I'm sorry, third century. He's talking about how they've had to separate the meal from the Eucharist itself. So we're talking approximately 100 years of worship without the meal. So there is no longer the need to have tables for everyone. This is not that same sense that you would have of a potluck dinner in your house. This is a full-blown liturgical, formalized service within the shape of a specific building that's built for it. Okay? Great. So we're going to move now east, and we're going to arrive at the Byzantine Cathedral at Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Just a point of clarification, it is not the Church of Saint Sophia. It is dedicated to the Holy Wisdom of God, and the feast day of Hagia Sophia is actually Christmas Day, because that is the birth of the Logos, as the birth of Christ. And so this is sometimes called Saint Sophia. It is not. It's Hagia Sophia, or the Holy Wisdom. Likewise, there's another church within eyeshot of Hagia Sophia called Hagia Irini, the Holy Peace. Yeah, the Holy Peace, not Saint Irene. Just point of clarification. So Hagia Sophia existed long before the current shape that it has right now. There were actually 2 previous churches on that same spot, both named Hagia Sophia. But during the reign of Saint Justinian, who was a 6th century emperor, there was a riot in the stadium during some chariot races, and the peasants, people, everyone in the city rioted. And as a result, the current structure of Hagia Sophia was burned to the ground. Hagia Irini was also destroyed in this same riot. Much of Constantinople is destroyed. This church is built between 532 and 537 under the reign of Emperor Justinian. The architects were Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles. They were not, in fact, architects. They were mathematicians. So they incorporated into their design the mathematical stylings of the day, and they actually ran into some architectural problems because they'd never designed a building before. But Emperor Justinian, Saint Justinian, gave them 2 charges: make it the most magnificent building in the history of mankind, and do it quickly. So they did it in 5 years, and it was dedicated in 537. The dome that they built was actually a little bit too low, and the pressures that it put on the church were so great that it collapsed. and they had to redesign the dome with a higher pitch so that the stress would be more evenly distributed. But in any event, so some of the features, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but some of the features are multiple entrances from 3 sides. The central ambo, the central pulpit, the elevated synthronon, and the altar and templo in what scholars call the P-pi shape, that it juts out into the church, comes across, and comes back like the letter P, capital pi. So what's important to note about Hagia Sophia in terms of the liturgy is that it both was shaped by the liturgy and then in turn shapes the liturgy after it. So Father Robert Taft, who is a Byzantine Rite Jesuit scholar, who's one of the foremost authors on Byzantine liturgy, writes in his the Byzantine history, the Byzantine Rite, short history. He says, quote, "The processional activity was directly responsible for the characteristic shape of the early Constantinopolitan church, with numerous entrances on all sides." And then later on in the same section, he says, "In this instance, form follows function. The liturgical arrangement of the Justinianic church building appears to have been dictated by the stational character of the urban rite. Its requirements were multiple," he says. Number 1, a place for people to gather while awaiting the solemn entrance. Unlike in old Rome, the basilicas, people did not enter the church beforehand to welcome the arrival of the procession. So there are very large atriums outside for everybody to gather as they wait for the procession to arrive. This is uncharacteristic of a basilica. An outer building for the same reason, where people could offer their gifts before the church was, quote, open liturgically with the prayer of the entrance and the solemn entrances. So the emergence of a building called the Scavophylacron, which is a separate building outside the church, we'll talk about that. Since the Constantinopolitan entrance, the clergy and the people enter the church together. The need to provide easy and rapid access to the nave, galleries from the outside, hence the monumental doorways not only in the west, but on the other, the north and the south sides of the church as well, so that everybody can come in. And I'll talk about these, I'm just running through what he says. A sheltered place for the patriarch and his escort to await and greet the emperor before the entrance on days when the imperial party participated in the liturgy publicly, and to await the arrival of the stational procession on days when the dignitaries did not take part in the station. A place for the prayer of the entrance before the royal doors, and in other services to perform the rites that preceded the patriarch's entrance into the church. So the monumental narthex. These are some of the liturgical, or some of the architectural features of Hagia Sophia that are dictated by what we spoke about last week, the stational liturgy of Constantinople. So a reminder about the way the liturgy was conducted in Constantinople that is different from the way it was conducted in Rome, and then therefore you have different styles, the Basilica in Rome, and then what we get with Hagia Sophia and later Byzantine Constantinopolitan churches. The liturgy didn't start in the church. The liturgy started on the way to church. The people would gather together throughout the city. They might go to several churches along the way as they walked to church, and they would chant psalms and hymns on the way to the church. Then they would all enter together. The bishop would stand at the front of the church. He would read the prayer of entrance, and then everyone would pour in, not just from the front, but also from the sides. So you have in Constantinople and Hagia Sophia entrances on the 3 sides, not on the east side because that's where the altar is itself and no one enters from the back of the church, but from the 3 sides. So everybody comes in because the whole community is processing to the church together. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the ambo, the synthronon, and some of the other features. So continuing on, this is a picture of what Hagia Sophia looks like today. Most of the key elements of its life as a church have been removed because of its conversion into a mosque following the fall of Constantinople and its present status as a museum. So these large pendants on the side, these are Arabic calligraphy from the time that the church was a mosque. Many of the icons have been covered over. These side areas right here had iconography on them that had been painted over. During the 1800s, they actually, I don't know why, they were doing some restoration work and they took off the paint, and an Italian artist went and made sketches of all the icons that were underneath before they were then painted over. Some of them still exist today. If you've excuse me, ever seen an icon of St. John Chrysostom where he appears to be in a Roman toga, and it says St. John Chrysostom in Greek, and it's a gold background. That icon is from Hagia Sophia, along with a few other hierarchs. Those are still visible because they're actually just really hard to get to, and so when they painted over them, they just didn't paint over them. But you see here, these are the seraphim and the cherubim, and characteristic of Hagia Sophia is this ring of 40 windows. As the light comes in, the space in between the windows is so small that as the light beams in, you lose that. You can't tell that each window is a separate window. And what you see is a halo of light around the dome. So many, many, many chroniclers of Hagia Sophia talk about how when you're standing in the church, it appears like the dome is floating above you. As I said, the understanding of the liturgy affects the architecture, and the architecture affects the understanding of the liturgy. So we also spoke about, going back to Father Alexander, the liturgy of the kingdom of God. And so the understanding that what is taking place in the church is the union of heaven and earth, and the separation between the two is extinguished, and you have the true experience of God's kingdom, which is the union of God with his people, us in his presence, him within our being. And so by putting this ring of windows and giving the illusion that the dome is floating, you have the understanding, or at least the intention of the architects was that Christ, who is depicted in the dome, is descending upon the church. And so that space between the church, the earth, and heaven is removed. So here again is another example of our understanding theologically of what's happening or happens in the Divine Liturgy affecting the shape of the place in which it's celebrated. Remember back to the basilicas and note and this is not a function of the Islamic Muslim conquests, this is typical of the church, but note the placement of the icons in Hagia Sophia is the same as the basilicas in Western Europe. So the icons are all in the upper levels. As you do later find icons in these galleries, unlike the basilicas where you had one two-story section and then on the sides you had one-story aisles, in Hagia Sophia everything goes, you have the main section right here, and then up here you have galleries. And on the galleries you will find iconography at a lower level, but those icons have all been put in after the iconoclastic period. So as Hagia Sophia was built by Justinian and intended to be by Justinian, all of the iconography was on the upper levels. The building itself was supposed to speak for the grandeur and the experience of the kingdom of God here on earth. The iconography contributes to that, but really the understanding was the massive columns, the amount of space that is contained within the domes, the quality of the materials that are used, all of these things fulfill a role that icons will later come of inspiring awe and grandeur in worship. They were all done by the architecture itself, not necessarily by the iconographic decoration of the church. So like I said, this is a picture of Hagia Sophia as it is now. Here is what it would have looked like in the time of Justinian. Here's a cutaway. Again, you can see the iconography right here, and the icons that would have been here. The dome has iconography with the Panagiotis, and you've got the main nave with 2 aisles on either side, and then, like I said, the galleries, which is a new addition not found in the Basilica-style churches. Moving on to a little bit more detail about Hagia Sophia, here is a schematic. So, as everyone entered from the sides and from the front, the focus of the church was here. You were looking in this direction, and here in the center, this is called the amvo, or what is the pulpit. It's a raised platform, so there's steps going up on this side, and then actually down on the other side, and this walkway that connects the amvo to the holy altar. That is called the solea. So solea actually was like a catwalk. The clergy would walk from the amvo to the altar. As everyone entered the church, they would go, the nave would fill up, the deacon carrying the gospel and anyone else who was chanting would go and take their place in the amvo, and then the bishop, the patriarch, and any other attending bishops or attending clergy would make their way into the holy altar, and they would sit in the synthronon. So this is characteristic of Hagia Sophia and Constantinople that existed in other churches, but not in the same way. So every church, like I said, you move the throne that's in the basilica to the back wall, and then you put your altar table there. It's the same setup here. There's the altar table in the middle, and there's the synthronon on the back. But this synthronon, this seat of the bishop, is raised. So you see it going up steps. And that is because while the reading of the scriptures and the chanting might be done here in the center of the church from this raised platform, the preaching of the bishop was done from his throne. And so while he's seated at the back of the altar, he needs to be seen by everybody. And as this is a large church, that position is elevated. So you could actually see him from the ground over the templo and over the altar table itself. So this is characteristic of Constantinople. The synthronon exists in other places, but it's not elevated. You have the templo, which is this screen. Remember I said it's in the pi shape. So you see like the capital letter P. Here it comes out and goes across. This is something for us to note because this will change over time as the liturgy changes. The altar juts out into the church. So the altar is impeding upon the space of the nave itself. It's kind of characteristic of how our parish is upstairs. You have the fence around the holy altar. It's not a flat wall that we'll see in later churches with space behind it. It actually comes out into the nave itself. You have over the altar table what's called a symborium, which is a canopy over the altar table. These are all things that are found in other churches but kind of reach their zenith architecturally here in Hagia Sophia. Again, the symborium has the same theological function as the dome does. That here, in our altar, we don't have a symborium, obviously, but above the altar table itself, there is a skylight. Has anyone ever noticed that? So I actually really hate that skylight. Why do we have a skylight above the altar table? Is it so that God can look down upon like he can see what's happening on the altar table? He doesn't need to see what's happening on the altar table. He's standing in front of it. He's there in front of me. He's at the table. I don't know why it was put in, but I always draw the comparison between the skylight above our altar table with the erection, which is the temple on one of the temples on the Acropolis. It's the temple, if you've ever seen the caryatid porch, the porch with the statues of the young women as the pillars. Well, on the other side of that building is there to commemorate at least 2, maybe 3 events. So it's actually 3 separate temples all put together in one. But it commemorates the contest between Athena and Poseidon over who would become the patron god of Athens. And she gives them an olive tree, and he strikes a rock with his trident, and from it comes out a salt spring, a spring with salt water. So behind the caryatid porch, there's a kind of fenced-in area where the tree that Athena planted, the olive tree, is there. Well, on the other side is the rock that Poseidon struck with his trident. And there's still a rock there with 3 marks on it, and it's covered underneath a nice little atrium courtyard, except for the fact that the spot where that rock is, directly right above it, no ceiling. So you have this ceiling, you have a skylight. You have this ceiling that covers the entire porch, except for 1 square is removed, so that Poseidon can look down upon the place where he struck the rock. So I always draw the parallel between, like, we've got this skylight, and God's not looking down upon the surface because he's there present with us. Poseidon's got to look down upon this thing because he's not there, because he doesn't exist. But this is also characteristic of all ancient, at least Greek and Roman temples. Their offerings and religious sites, while they had a temple, the temple just housed the statue of the god and was a treasure. The sacrifices would be offered outside in the courtyard of the temple so that the smoke from the burnt sacrifices could rise up to the gods in heaven. So everything they did was outdoors. Another reason why the church is inside, because it understands the coming together of heaven and earth. There is not this separation. We aren't sending things up to God. God is in our presence there. He has descended, and so his presence has descended upon the earth almost like a dome or a roof. So this is all a very long way of saying that symbolion over the altar fulfills the same theological role as the dome, the descending of God's presence upon his people. You would have the emperor's throne probably somewhere over here. The emperor would, in fact, come into the altar to receive Holy Communion in the altar, along with some other dignitaries and governors in other regions as well. So, not pictured in this is what is on this side over here. Outside of the building, there is a baptistry. And so the baptistry is separate from the church, and on the other side, right over here, would be the Scevophylakium, which is the place where people would drop off their offerings, their bread, their wine, their oil, whatever it is that they were offering. And I spoke about this a little bit last week in context of the Scevophylakium. So as people are coming, if the church is not open because the bishop hasn't arrived and we haven't said the prayer of entrance, what do you do if you get to church and you're offering bread and wine to be used in that liturgy and the church doors are still closed because the bishop's not there? Well, you've got to take it to a side building and they hold it there because there's a liturgical action of opening the doors and everyone coming in together. And it's improper for you to enter the church alone because you're entering into the kingdom of God with the citizens of the kingdom of God. You're entering into his presence with all of the gathered people, not just you individually. So you can't go into church to drop off your offering, but your offering needs to be there before liturgy starts. So they have this separate building over here called the Scevophylakium. It's literally just like a storehouse. Skeva are like utensils. It's the place where you guard all the liturgical utensils. So everything's kept there. So because of that, because things are kept there, because you can't get into the church, when you have the great entrance to offer the bread and wine, the deacon leaves the altar and he goes outside through a side entrance and goes into the Scevophylakium. He takes the bread that he's going to use, he puts it on a paten, he takes the wine that they're going to use, he pours it into a chalice, he reads the prayers of offering over them, and then he goes from outside around the building and through the center aisle. So, as I said last week, talking about the history and development of the liturgy, the shape of the church dictated what happened liturgically. So the fact that now we have this great entrance where we carry the wine and the bread that will be offered and consecrated to become the body and blood of Christ, that whole action of leaving the side of the altar and walking around the entire church and then coming back up the center aisle, that's all a result of the way in which Hagia Sophia was built. So our current liturgical actions are directly related to the architecture of Justinian. The baptism, the baptismal area, the baptistry being over here, does the very same thing. So if you've been to an Orthodox baptism, and I'm sure most of you have, there is a section of the baptism when you have the baby or person, adult, whoever it is, comes back out after being changed and dressed, and the godparents and family all take candles, and the priest takes the censer, and they walk around the font 3 times. Well, if you're being baptized in the period of Justinian, you're being baptized not in a private service on some Saturday because you're going out to lunch afterward, but you're being baptized with everybody else that year who's being baptized on Holy Saturday during the midnight vigil of Easter, of Pascha. And because it's dark, you have candles. And because you're outside of the church, you have to walk from the baptistry to the church. And so this action that we do in a baptism, where we take candles, we walk around a circle 3 times, that is the procession of all the newly illumined, newly baptized Christians leaving the baptistry, which is up over here, and coming around the church, led by their candles, and into the church to participate in the rest of the Divine Liturgy. So again, the architecture of the church dictates what we do liturgically and has influenced it in that way. If you've been to the Divine Liturgy on Holy Saturday morning, if you haven't, you're missing out. It is the best service of the year. I will be controversial and say that I prefer Holy Saturday morning to a Gnostic evening, which sounds crazy, but it's just that good. That Divine Liturgy is the Divine Liturgy that used to be the midnight vigil. It got moved earlier into the day, and then we added another one to take its place. I'm not going to get into it. But that Divine Liturgy is filled with baptismal imagery. So there are 15 Old Testament readings that are prescribed. We only read 3 of them now. You're all lucky. There are 15 that are prescribed, that are in the book. Why 15? Well, it takes a long time to baptize hundreds of people. So everyone came to church and went into the church with the bishop, and they started the service. And then the people who were to be baptized, they went out to the baptistry, and the bishop went out and baptized them. And while he was doing the baptisms, the people inside the church are hearing the Old Testament readings. Number 1, about Christ's resurrection, all these Old Testament types of his resurrection, but also types of baptism. So there are the accounts of the Jews crossing the Red Sea, passing through water, coming to the Promised Land. That is the same as people going through baptism, going into the water and coming out, entering into the Promised Land of God's kingdom. So there's these 2 things that are happening. Yes, the resurrection of Christ, but also the baptismal imagery. That's still maintained to this day, even though we're no longer doing baptisms outside. You see this because what are they chanting when they come in after being baptized? They're chanting, all those who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ, Alleluia. So, on Holy Saturday morning, when we're celebrating this liturgy, instead of chanting, Aios of Theos, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, have mercy on us, which was the entrance hymn, we replace the entrance hymn, the standard entrance hymn, with all those who have been baptized, Osis Christon. So, again, what we do now, today, is a direct result of the liturgical practices, which are a direct result of the shape of Hagia Sophia. So it is really, it's impact in the liturgy is remarkable, and we can't diminish it in any way. We often hold up this church as just a being of beauty, and we don't think enough about how its importance, Hagia Sophia's importance to the church, is not just because it's the seat of imperial power during the Byzantine Empire, and it's not just because it's the cathedral church of the ecumenical patriarch. It's not just because it's a beautiful building. It's because it has shaped our worship even to this day, and we can see in the things that we do today the impact of just two architects, two mathematicians from 1,500 years ago. So those are some examples of how the architecture of the church impacted the Divine Liturgy itself. I'm going to move on to Hagia Irini for a little bit, but does anybody have any questions about Hagia Sophia before I do? Wow, okay. I was expecting something. Great, everybody's on the same page. Hagia Irini, also built by St. Constantine and destroyed in the Nika riots. This church, however, is kind of, in a way, a fusion of the Basilica style and the new features of the Constantinopolitan church. This was also built by Justinian, but in no way was it on par with Hagia Sophia, and it did not have the same liturgical impact that Hagia Sophia did have. But you can see this melding of the two styles. So it's a Basilica style. Let me go. So it's a Basilica style church. Again, you've got the nave. This is a kind of zoomed in picture, but imagine, just like we saw with old St. Peter's, you've got this large nave here in the center in a rectangular form, and you have the colonnade on either side. Now where Constantinople affects the Basilica is it adds a gallery up top, which is just like we have in Hagia Sophia. You also have the raised synthronome, just like you have in Hagia Sophia. So this church is really a melding of what becomes the Byzantine standard in Hagia Sophia and the traditional Roman basilica, with elements of both. Now, Hagia Irini is a great study in what happens to the architecture of the church, not in its construction, but in what happens to it later. So you'll see, just like in Hagia Sophia and just like in the basilicas, there is no iconography on the lower level. There's also no iconography except for this one cross on the upper level. That's because in the 740s, there was a major earthquake and almost the entire upper level of the church was destroyed. And it was repaired by, I believe, Constantine V. Did I mark that? Yes, Constantine V, who was an iconoclast. So, as he rebuilt this church, he did not add icons in the traditional space for iconography in the Basilica or the Constantinopolitan Cathedral. He instead put one single cross in the center apse. This space traditionally, and in Hagia Sophia it is so, but this space traditionally was the space for an icon of the Panagia, the Platitera, which is what almost all Orthodox churches have now in that apse. That image was unacceptable to iconoclasts, and so the only image that was acceptable, there were only two things that the iconoclasts said could function as an image. The cross could be depicted, and the Eucharist, the Divine Liturgy itself, was an image of Christ. So you couldn't depict Christ in art, but he is depicted, an image of him is present in the Eucharist itself. So Hagia Irini starts off on the same trajectory that all of these other churches do, poised for more iconography as time goes on. But because of the damage that happened during the iconoclastic period, which was, I'm sorry, I didn't clarify, a period where the church, the empire and the church itself was vehemently opposed to the use of images in worship, because this reconstruction happened at that point in time, you don't have any of the traditional iconography in the church. So here again you have the policies, the politics, and the theology or the heresy of the day affecting the architecture of the church itself. Any questions about Irini before we move on? Yeah.
Is that still an Orthodox church, or is that a museum, or?
It is in fact a concert hall now. So it's used for public presentations and concerts. The Archdiocesan Byzantine choir 2 or 3 years ago traveled to Constantinople, and they performed a concert of Byzantine hymns in Hagia Irini, but it's used for secular music as well, and meetings and presentations and symposia and any type of public, panel discussion. So it no longer functions as a church. It hasn't functioned as a church since the Muslim conquest of Constantinople, and it doesn't even function really. It is labeled a museum, but it's used more often than not as a concert venue or a public forum. So this is what happens during iconoclasm to the church. Now, iconoclasm is defeated in the 9th century finally, and this defeat comes at the hand of a monastic piety. The defenders of icons were the monks of the Studite monastery and the Savas monastery. St. Savas monastery is in Palestine, and the Studite monastery is actually in Constantinople. So it might be on the other side of the Bosphorus, but it's in the neighborhood. So the Studite monks were the most vocal opponents to iconoclasm. They fought for the use and continuation of icons within the church, and this victory for the monastic piety in the church has a profound impact on the architecture, and then also a profound impact on the Divine Liturgy itself. So in a monastery, you are not having a stational liturgy. You're not starting off, from one part of the city and walking across. You're walking 10 steps from your cell to the center church. So the liturgy in a monastery did not have that same stational, processional feel that it does in the cities. So there's already kind of a dichotomy existing in the church between what's done in the cathedral and what's done in the monastery. And so as a result, as the Studites and the monks of St. Savas, actually come to the Studite monastery and have a huge impact liturgically. But as these monastic centers begin to have influence, bishops are selected from amongst the monks of the Savas monastery, of the Studite monastery, of the sleepless monks, and these different monasteries around the city. And so as these monks are pulled into ecclesiastical hierarchy and positions of power, they bring with them their own traditions. And so the stational liturgies in Constantinople decrease. The stational liturgies outside of Constantinople almost completely decrease or disappear. We hear of St. Simeon of Thessaloniki in, I believe, the 14th century, 14th or 15th century, who he still has at his cathedral in Thessaloniki. He still has a stational liturgy to some extent, but it's much reduced. But he's like one of the last people who still maintains the worship in his parish as it was done in Hagia Sophia. By that point in time, it's almost gone everywhere else because of the influence of the monastic order of the Divine Liturgy. Iconography starts to move its way down the walls of the church. As you are victorious, you show off your victory. So if the upper levels of the church were originally the only place for iconography, well, if we've got more horizontal surfaces and they aren't honestly, they don't even need to be horizontal. If you've got more surfaces for us to put icons on to prove God's favor with the use of iconography, we will. And so iconography starts to move down the walls of the church and up from the floor. So, I don't want to jump back. Yeah, I'll jump back. Here, we're in Constantinople. We're again at Hagia Sophia. This chancel barrier, or what's called the templo, that separates the altar itself, the Holy of Holies, from the nave of the church. These are pillars, and that space between the pillars are open, so you can see through. Maybe. We're not entirely sure. They were either open or they had curtains. People argue, we're not really sure. What's sure is that there's definitely a curtain in the front of the Symbolium and a curtain right here, but the rest of it very well might have been open, and there were no icons there because it's the ground level. Jenna.
So the curtains are borrowing from Judaism?
Yes.
Okay.
So in the temple in Jerusalem that Solomon builds, the directions he receives from God, and actually the directions that Moses receives when he makes the tent for the ark, they have a curtain around the Ark of the Covenant, and that curtain, it's only the high priest goes in through the curtain because God dwells literally sits upon the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is called the mercy seat. It's his footstool is a term that we hear sometimes in the church and in the Psalms. It's where God sat. And so only the high priest went in once a year to make atonement for sins. And that walling off with a curtain in the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple is where, if there is a curtain, again, I'm not sure, I've seen schematics of both, and I haven't been able to find a good definitive answer. But if there were curtains, that would be the reason. The reason would be to carry the understanding that this is the Holy of Holies, upon the table upon which God will descend. So that's why there are curtains. But there are no icons. And let's just presume that we can see through, and there aren't curtains. I mean, it's really hard. If the whole point of putting the bishop way up here is so that everybody can see him, and everybody right down here has a curtain in front of their face, it's going to be pretty hard to see him. So my bet, unprofessionally, and just I'm taking a swing in the dark, is that there weren't curtains, although we are sure that there was one in front here, because the liturgical texts talk about closing the curtain during the consecration. That's the only one we know. Anyway, so as icons are descending from the top, they're also ascending from the bottom. So this area right here that was open, as we go forward into post-iconoclastic period, and this is a really hard picture to see, and when I sent out the slides, so hopefully you all received them, you can look better, but right here, this is what's left in this particular parish, this particular monastery, of the icon screen, or of the templo, or the chancel barrier, this right here. So we have icons coming down. You can see them right here on the side. They haven't made it all the way down to the floor yet at this period, but they're working their way down. And these are coming up. So you're filling the space, and eventually the two will meet, and every surface will be covered with icons. What's also important to note is that P-shaped altar gets pushed back. So no longer do you have an altar area that is jutting out into the nave, but you have something that is a completely straight wall cutting off the nave. So the nave goes down all the way, and then you hit a wall, and that wall is decorated with icons. And behind that wall is the space of the altar, but that altar doesn't protrude out into the space of the church. This particular church is the Church of Osios Lukas, which is in mainland Greece. It was built in the 10th century, so post-iconoclasm, and we'll see in a little bit as we look at the schematic how the church differs here from Constantinople, and it's one of the best examples of the early stages of kind of post-iconoclasm iconography. But with the victory of the iconophiles, or iconodules as they're called, the monastic piety, comes the understanding that as we're decorating the church and we're using icons more freely, we are depicting in art, in our worship, events that happened during the life of Christ. So if you go back, you know, there's different types of iconography. What Hagia Sophia has, they have Panagia above, in the apse above the altar, and they have the cherubim and the seraphim, and they have the different saints, but they're not exactly depicting biblical events. And that starts to happen. It was present, as we saw in Dura Europos, but it starts to really happen in the post-iconoclastic period, or more prominently. So as we start looking and seeing more regularly icons of the events of Christ's life, the interpretation of the Divine Liturgy starts to shift a little bit. And so instead of maintaining, or maybe adding to, I don't want to put these two things as in opposition, they really are held together in the tradition of the church. And we'll talk about this in the last week when we talk about interpretation and commentary. But maybe an earlier emphasis on the presence in God's kingdom, the future expectation of salvation experienced now in a foretaste, as we call it, that starts to be replaced or de-emphasized, and what starts to be emphasized is the liturgy as an icon of Christ's life. And so that becomes almost more important. So these liturgical actions that performed a function earlier now get reinterpreted in this iconographic way. So icons affecting the interpretation and the practice of the Divine Liturgy. So the small entrance, which originally would be the entire community coming together and entering the church all together as one, as an act of entering into God's holy kingdom, now is understood or thought of more regularly as Christ's entering to give his public ministry. So after his baptism, when he begins preaching. The great entrance, which was the ceremonial act of bringing the offerings from the people, from outside the church to inside the church, that gets interpreted now as Christ coming to be sacrificed, him carrying his cross, and being sacrificed on the altar table. Again, these things are all present in the early interpretations, but they're not emphasized to the same extent as they are after iconoclasm, because iconoclasm made everything an icon, or the victory over iconoclasm made everything an icon, and so now the liturgical actions are interpreted as iconographic events, looking backwards as opposed to looking forward. So because of that, the Divine Liturgy is less something that is participated in by the people. You know, you think about you're performing a liturgical act when you walk into church with the bishop and the entire community. You're participating. You might just be walking in, but that's a liturgical, spiritual act, because you are walking into the kingdom of God, and you're not doing it alone. You're not doing it on your own time. You're not doing it when you arrive. You're doing it with the entire community. So the understanding that all of God's people are walking together into his kingdom, kind of communal understanding of salvation. Well, if you're no longer performing that main entrance together, because in a monastic piety, you don't have to enter together because you're already there at the church because you live there, people start to come as they come, because there's no longer this great entrance of everybody all together. And because of that, the churches get smaller, and when the churches get smaller, it actually makes it easier to put more icons up, because you don't have these grand spaces to fill visually. And Father Taft makes the point that you can stand inside Osius Lukas and you can see all the walls. but you can't stand inside Hagia Sophia and see all of it because it's just too big and too grand. So as your field of vision becomes more narrow, then you can fill that space more readily with iconography. But one of the main things that this does is it pushes the templo, which we saw was in a P shape in Hagia Sophia, it pushes it back and it flattens it, which is where this whole conversation started 10 minutes ago before I digressed. Anyway, because you are now the people no longer participating, you're watching the icon of Christ's life. And so as a spectator, you are essentially watching, and this is, I don't want to push this too hard, this is the words of my liturgics professor coming out, who was much more adamant and anti this development in the church. But he says, you're essentially going to a play, especially if you're not receiving communion. And everything that's happening is happening in front of you. You're no longer making an entrance outside of the church with the gifts. You're no longer, all entering together at the small entrance. All of the liturgical actions move back. The altar moves back, and you have a screen, almost like the curtain of an auditorium, and all of the action takes place in front of you. So the priests and the deacons leave from the side doors, and they come out, and you're there to watch, but you're not there to necessarily participate. Or your participation is just your presence and you watching. So a very different understanding, because now it's not so much your presence in the kingdom of God, but it's your education and your, watching the mystery of Christ's life unfold before you. So this is Osios Lukas. We're going to look at this is a schematic of it. And so you can see some of the things that change from that cutaway that we saw of Hagia Sophia to Osios Lukas. So here is, there are two churches. This is the Church of the Panagia, and this is the Central Catholicon, Central Church. So you see here, this thick line right here, this is what becomes the iconostasis, which is the rising up of those icons from the floor to create a very visible and real barrier that prevents you from being able to see into the altar. If I go back, and you see the only window into the altar is this small, and it is very small. Priests aren't necessarily the most healthy people, and sometimes we tend to be on the larger side. So thank God they're monks and they fast, because they can fit through that. They can fit through that door because it's small. I've been to this church; it's gorgeous. But anyway, so that is that section right here. That's that moving back, because you're now watching. You're not participating. You're watching, and all the action takes place in front of you here in the center dome. And so the priests and the deacons come out over here, and then they go right back in. They still have the apse, but as you'll see in the upper church, the Church of the Theotokos, what was present in Hagia Sophia was one central apse. And we saw it in Apollinaris in Ravenna, and we saw it in the Basilica of Old St. Peter's, and we saw it even in Hagia Erini. All of those churches had one main apse in the back of the church. Well, there were three now. Those other two, people argue for different things. One of them is very, very clear, and the other one is a question. So if there is a central apse in Hagia Sophia, but there's also a Scaphophylacterion on this side and a baptistry on this side, they get sucked into the building itself and become part of the building proper. And so this one right here, that's called the prothesis, which means the table of preparation, that is now where the priest and the deacon celebrate the preparation of the bread and the wine for Holy Communion. It's no longer outside in a separate building. That building has been pulled in to this apse right here. Now the question is, do they add one on the other side that's called the antiprothesis, which just means on the opposite side of the prothesis table because of symmetry, or is that the baptistry that gets sucked in as well? My bet is that is just a matter of symmetry, and that the baptistry actually, in a monastery, they don't have baptistries because they're not performing baptisms. There's They're there to celebrate the Divine Liturgy, and if they celebrate a baptism, they set up a font in the middle of the church. So the fact that this is a monastery and they're not including a baptistry in their plans makes me think that this is part of the symmetry. George?
What is the function of ours in this building? What do you do?
The antiprotheses, or the protheses?
No, the antiprothesis.
The antiprotheses is a storage space, and really it is at this point. So we here at St. Peter and Paul has become characteristic of Orthodox churches post-iconoclasm to have 3 apses. We've got the center one, and then the protheses right here, where we still celebrate the service of Proscomidi, the preparation of the gifts. And then on the other side, I keep our blessing cross and the extra gospel that we have, and liturgical items that I need to. I try not to clutter it up. To be honest, I like a clean altar. I was berated once as a seminarian for putting a piece of paper on the altar table, and ever since then I'm trying to keep the altar as free of debris as possible. So the blessing cross I keep over there. Most priests keep the blessing cross on the altar table itself. I don't, because as a priest I don't have the blessing to bless with a blessing cross. Liturgically speaking, only the bishop has the right to bless with a blessing cross. That's not what is currently practiced across the archdiocese. You'll see priests wielding blessing crosses like it's their right hand. But if you read the notes in your Divine Liturgy book that is put out by the archdiocese, the newest one, it does make a note that the priest never blesses with the blessing cross. He only blesses with his hand. And so I actually just, not that I'm susceptible to the temptation of it, but in recognition of the fact that I do not have the blessing to use it, I don't keep it on the altar table. I keep it over there, and then I keep the second gospel that we bring out on Sunday mornings for veneration. That gospel is stored there, but it's really just a storage space at this point in time. There's no need, really, there's no need for those things to even be there. No parish needs multiple gospels. You need a gospel. We're actually not even supposed to leave the gospel in the back of the church to be venerated on Sundays. We're supposed to bring it out for veneration and then bring it back into the altar. But we do out of economy. Thank you. That's the word. Economy. Allowing those people who are not at the who are not at the Orthros, in order to venerate at time, in order to venerate, the opportunity to venerate. So it's an act of economia. The strict liturgics of it, it doesn't belong there. So there's really, and there's no need to keep the blessing cross there. So it's a kind of utilitarian storage space. Parishes that have relics will store relics there. That's the most appropriate place for the storing of relics, unless you have an established reliquary within your church. Unfortunately, our parish does not have any relics besides what's in the altar table itself. I would love to adorn the antiprotheses with the relics of the saints of the church, but that's a conversation for another day. So this is the basic structure that comes out of the post-iconoclastic period. And this is a kind of general mock-up of what a church looks like. The church kind of takes its form after iconoclasm as we have it today. Now obviously there's a great, as I said, this is kind of a general overview. There is a wide variety of church structure and shape, but they all conform to the basic things that are present in this diagram. So we see things maintained from the early Basilica period all the way through the post-iconoclastic period here. So the narthex, this is something that has always been a part of the church. It comes from the atrium of the basilica, or even the atrium of the house church. So it is a fundamental part of the church. The nave, again, a fundamental part of the church, going all the way back to the basilica period. And then here's the icon screen itself. This is now flat in most churches. St. Peter and Paul is the exception. It has the P-shaped chancel screen with the icons on it. We are unique in that regard, but most Orthodox churches in the present day have a straight iconostasis that completely cuts off the altar itself from view, with the exception of the royal, or the beautiful gates. I could talk about the different icons on the iconostases. They all have their own place and things like that, but I'm going to leave that off for today. And then you have the apse back here, and then theoretically right there, that's the antiprotheses table. In most churches, there'll be an alcove or a little apse there, which is mirrored on the other side. Right here, this throne is the bishop's throne. That throne, if we remember back to the depiction of Hagia Sophia, that is actually where the emperor would sit, and the bishop's throne is back here in this back apse where the synthronon would be. We use this throne in the Greek tradition because the patriarchs of Constantinople, following the fall of Constantinople to the Muslims, were invested with civic as well as religious authority over the Orthodox populations of the Ottoman Empire. So they moved their seat to the seat of the bishop, or to the seat of the emperor, because now they had civil authority and civil power, and that is where they could not allow a Muslim sultan into the altar to invest them and install them with their, when a new patriarch is elected, they're not going to allow the sultan to come into the altar to establish the new patriarch on the synthronon in the altar. So the seat that used to be for the emperor, now the sultan is giving him civic authority, so the sultan is installing him here outside of the altar where the emperor used to sit. If you go to churches in regions that were never under Ottoman control, you will see that there is not a seat to the side for the bishop because they never had that civic role as they did in the Ottoman Empire. That's kind of it in terms of the architecture of the church. I'm going to speak a little bit about the iconography of the Divine Liturgy before I shift gears and move into iconography. Are there any questions about architecture, how it influenced the shape of the Divine Liturgy, or how the Divine Liturgy in the early church shaped the architecture of the buildings? Great. Or did you have a question? Okay. All right. Well, think while I'm talking. You can just drown out the next things I'm going to say for 5 minutes and come back to me with your questions. So I've been talking about how architecture and the icons of the church that are used in the church are affected by the Divine Liturgy of the time, but also how the theology of the time and the use of icons and the architecture has shaped the development of the Divine Liturgy. You see that, especially within Hagia Sophia, and how the shape of the liturgy was dependent upon the shape of the church, and how that comes down to us today, but also how in a post-iconoclastic period, the theological understandings of the day changed the shape of the church, and the change in the shape of the church changed the worship procedures. So we're also going to talk about the theological understanding, not icons in the church, but icons of the Divine Liturgy, how the church depicts the Divine Liturgy and iconography, because there's the same, back and forth between them. So here we have two icons of the Divine Liturgy. There, of course, are icons of the Last Supper that are usually placed above the royal gates, or the beautiful gates, above the entrance to the altar. But those it's not necessarily always there, and it's less prominent. If you think about Saints Peter and Paul, we do not have an icon of the Last Supper above the entrance to the Holy Altar. But what we do have is in the dome an icon of the angels celebrating the great entrance, presenting the gifts to Christ who's standing at the altar table. That's what's depicted right here, and this might look similar to what, when you're looking at the altar, the icon we have of Christ right above in the Panagiotis. So what's important to note about the way the church depicts the Divine Liturgy is it is a heavenly service. They very, very rarely will the church depict the human beings, the people of the church, celebrating the Divine Liturgy. There are, of course, exceptions. And there's times when we're depicting a specific event in the history of the church where you will see people celebrate, you will see, the exaltation of the cross is one of them. So you've got the Bishop of Jerusalem holding up the cross in the middle of the church. That's obviously done in the context of a service, but that's commemorating a specific event. When the church tries to depict the Divine Liturgy, it always uses Christ as the celebrant and the angels as the ministers, be they priests, deacons, or acolytes, altar boys. So Christ is depicted not as he was at the Last Supper, but he is depicted as the hierarch. So Christ is vested as a hierarch would be. And you can see that here, and you can see it again right here. So this piece of vestment right here is called the homophorion, and that is the characteristic vestment of a bishop. And so Christ is depicted as the celebrant of the Divine Liturgy. Why is Christ depicted as the celebrant of the Divine Liturgy? Well, you only need to look to the Divine Liturgy and the text of it to see that. In the anaphora of St. John Chrysostom, we say, "You are the one who both offers and is offered." Christ is the celebrant of the Divine Liturgy, and the priest stands in his place. Without going way on a tangent like I typically do, the theology of the church is that the bishop is the celebrant of the Divine Liturgy, and the priest only celebrates the Divine Liturgy as the bishop allows him. I mentioned that anonymisium, that little tablecloth earlier, that has the bishop's signature on it. That's the bishop's express permission for the priest to celebrate the Divine Liturgy. If you run afoul of the bishop, he will take back that piece of paper, or that cloth, take back his signature, take back his authority for you to celebrate the Divine Liturgy. The bishop does not need that authority. He celebrates the Divine Liturgy because he is the president of the Eucharist, which is a term that goes all the way back to the apologists, to the 1st and 2nd century. He is the presider, and he represents Christ. The priests, we don't. We represent the apostles. We are not the representative of Christ. Now, I'm going to do it again. This is a fractal relationship, and I'm not even going to get into fractals, so let's just leave it off at that. So the bishop represents Christ, and so Christ, depicted in the Divine Liturgy, is not depicted as a priest, he's depicted as the hierarch. When the bishop is seated on the synthronon with his priests and everybody else gathered around him, I've made this point a couple of times, that liturgical action comes straight out of the book of Revelation, where St. John has a vision of Christ seated on his throne with, as he promised in Matthew, with the 12 apostles and the 12 patriarchs of Israel seated around him. So that vision of heaven is here on earth in the bishop sitting at the synthronon. So again, we see all these different layers, but that just goes to show you that the bishop represents Christ and his apostles, the priests. So that is why Christ is always depicted when he is celebrating the liturgy. He is the one who offers and is offered, because the bishop is the one who offers, and the bishop offers Christ, and the bishop represents and stands in the place of Christ as the liturgical president of the community. So here we have Christ standing at the altar table, performing the consecration, offering and being offered, coming straight from the Divine Liturgy itself. And here we have what's the end of the great entrance. So the people are bringing the gifts, the angels serving as the priests and the deacons, bringing the censer, and Christ is blessing and receiving them. And here you have, there's the chalice, and behind the chalice you'll have the paten with the bread. So this is an iconographic depiction of the great entrance. This is an iconographic depiction of the consecration. So the way the church depicts its Divine Liturgy is a result of the theology and understanding of the Divine Liturgy. So here you have theology influencing art. And then there's one more thing that I included on this. This is probably not as well known to many of you, but it's an icon of the sacrifice on the table. Here we have St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil, and here on the paten itself is Christ as a child. Here's the same thing depicted again as a heavenly reality with Christ as a child being offered on the altar table. Remember I said there's kind of these two veins going within the church. There is the forward-looking, end-of-times experience of the kingdom of heaven, which is what we have here. We're standing in the kingdom of heaven, and Christ, our high priest, is offering the sacrifice, and so we're looking forward to and we're experiencing heaven. But Saint Nephon in the 4th century had a vision, and this is one of those backwards-looking things, of the bread that was offered on the paten transforming into Christ as a child, and literally being offered up and sacrificed before his eyes as he prays the prayers of the consecration. So these icons are a depiction of the vision that St. Nephon had, who was a 4th century bishop. And you have that kind of backwards-looking iconographic depiction of the Divine Liturgy. So as we were talking about post-iconoclasm, I said these things, it's really it's a difference of emphasis and overemphasis or underemphasis. It's not that they don't both exist at the same time. It's just how they're emphasized. So this is a much more popular depiction in more recent centuries. This, although it is a vision dating back to the 4th century, is not represented in iconography as early as Christ celebrating the Divine Liturgy. But here you have that understanding of the liturgy as an icon of the events of Christ's life. So in the icon, we are depicting Christ's bodily sacrifice on the cross in the sacrifice of the Divine Liturgy. So there are many interpretations along this line that see the great entrance and the bringing of the bread, consecratory prayers, consecrating and being the moment of Christ's sacrifice. So here's that other kind of later emphasis depicted in icons. So there's two ways that the church depicts icons. That one kind of forward-looking celebration of the heavenly kingdom, and this kind of backward-looking icon of Christ's life. So just to kind of wrap us up tonight, we come to the conclusion that I've been bringing up throughout this whole thing, which is the architecture and the iconography of the church have shaped the way in which the church worships, and then the way in which the church worships has also shaped the architecture and the iconography. There's this symbiotic relationship between them, and you see that in the stational liturgies shaping, literally shaping Hagia Sophia, but the liturgy of Hagia Sophia shaping the rest of Orthodox Christian worship, and then the iconoclastic period, changing the shape of the church, which changes the way that we function. So here we have this relationship, this mutually beneficial or mutually informative relationship of art, architecture, and worship. Any questions as we come to an end tonight? Did you remember? No?
I was thinking, I like the house church better. I think that's personally. It just almost looks simpler and kind of just have to focus on Christ and the Divine Liturgy and the Eucharist. And through the years, since we've added so many things and it's taken away, just in my eyes.
Yeah, it is a matter of perspective. I mean, there are plenty of people who prefer a more simply adorned church, with the understanding behind highly decorated churches. And here's a great example of it. The most beautiful vestments you will ever see are in monasteries. I mean, the most beautifully handcrafted, jewel-encrusted pieces of fabric you will ever lay your eyes upon come out of monasteries. And the people who wear them have holes in their shoes, and they have holes in their cassocks, and when they are not in the Divine Liturgy, they look ragged. Because in the world, that is their piety, that is their sacrifice, that is their separation from desire and lust for material things, but when they're in the Divine Liturgy, those same people who will wear a cassock until it literally falls off their body array themselves more beautifully than any of us could ever imagine, because they understand that when they're in that church, they are standing in the presence of God, and they are standing in His kingdom, which is glorious. So there is, a give and take between how much do we decorate our churches, to what extent. They shouldn't be, the decoration should not take away from worship, they should always enhance worship. And people have different ideas of what enhancing worship through decoration actually means. You're not going to please everybody, so don't try.
I found a lot when I was in church, Greece. I found a lot of churches beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
but I was looking more in the sense like we took something we could see,
Mm-hmm.
and then we hide it with the icon. Why are we hiding it when we should all be celebrating it?
Right.
That's what's hard. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Right.
more.
No. It's a great point, Georgia.
I have a question, which is, why is our church appears to be different than other Greek Orthodox churches. It appears to be influenced by the architecture of, mid-century modern or something. But are there, at least speaking, ecclesiastical reasons, at least at that time, for why its appearance differs from other Greek churches?
No, you know what? Honestly, I wasn't here, so I couldn't tell. I didn't sit in those committee meetings. But you're right. I was not born. 27 years later. Anyway, there's a sorry. And this is just speculation. I hope this is not an offensive comment. But there was a sentiment in early and mid-century church construction to throw off the appearance of old world churches. There was a spirit of assimilation in that time period, and so you have, and I'm not going to mention us, I'll take it outside of St. Peter and Paul. I hope you're not watching Milwaukee. Milwaukee is a prime example of a church that was put assimilation and a desire to show an American presentation of the faith over a traditional approach. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but a Frank Lloyd Wright designed church speaks more to the desire of the founders to participate in the architectural culture of the period and the place than a desire to maintain traditions. Again, I'm not saying one's better than the other, but what you'll notice is that as churches are being built, especially in our metropolis, but even outside our metropolis, I have a few friends who serve at parishes around the country, new parishes within the last 5 to 10 years. There's a neo-Byzantine revival. They are not building churches in 2015, 2016, 2017 that look like churches that were built in 1950 or 1960. They are building churches that look like the architect, drew the plans in the 1800s or even before that. There's a return to that more traditional approach to architecture. I'm not going to say, like I said, one's not better than the other. Here at St. Peter and Paul, we're blessed that we have, I'm blessed that I can talk to you about the P-shaped, templo, and you guys have an understanding of what I'm talking about, and you don't think I'm making stuff up. Because you experience what liturgy was like. I mean, that was the way the church was built. Now we still have pews, and you still are pretty much, in some sense, if the church doesn't facilitate the church architecture of St. Peter and Paul, and I will say the church architecture of the majority of Orthodox churches in the last 1,000 years, do not facilitate the communal participation that was so prominent in the early period of the church. It's as great as St. Peter and Paul is for having an open altar. It's just an open space for you to look at. You can still stand in your pew and do nothing in the Divine Liturgy, but in Constantinople, I mean, you walked in together. I mean, the priest or the deacon was preaching literally in the middle. St. John Chrysostom complains in the middle of his sermons that people are leaning against the gates or the low, templo because they're just like, they're either tired or they're trying to lean in and listen. I mean, they were like right there. If you're not at the end of your pew and I'm not, walking right along your aisle, unless you're singing, which you should, why are you like, what real tangible participation do you have in the service of the church outside of obviously your participation in the sacrament of the Eucharist? It's a different mindset. It's a different, and that's a result of how we build our churches. Give me a. So St. Hagia Sophia was built because of a riot. You guys, I do something that upset you, and you all riot, and you burn the church down. I'm going to rebuild it. I'm going to take the pews out, and I'll just put chairs along the side, and I'll get you guys a lot closer to the action. So please don't riot. Please don't down our church. But yeah, so the architecture does affect the piety, and that's never more evident than the understanding that many people just are watching the Divine Liturgy. Janet.
So, when did cry rooms come about? It seems counter to what the mission is.
Well, my kids are the loudest ones in church, and we don't make use of the cry room. So I agree with you. It is counter to the mission of the church. Cry rooms really come about in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but not in the form of cry rooms. It comes about in the establishment of Sunday schools, which started not in the Orthodox Church, but they started in Protestant churches as a way of educating children. This being because in many of these denominations, the emphasis is placed on study and preaching. Preaching is the high point of worship, not the consecration or the reception of the sacrament. So as preaching and education and study are valued in these faiths, they introduce a level of school, and that pulls the kids outside of the general parish worship. And then once the kids are out, then you establish spaces for them, and then it turns from a place of their instruction to a place for them not to disturb the rest of the worship, because you've gotten used to not having kids there. So now we have a place for them to go, so that they're not there. Personally speaking, your kids need to be in church. That's the only way they're going to learn how to be in church. There are families that bring their kids. I have got one. I love this family. And one of the first couples I married, and they are the first couple that I married and then baptized their child, which was great. But he is maybe a year old now, not even. And since his baptism, God bless his parents. His father is Catholic, his mother is Orthodox, but they are in church, I would say, every Sunday, if not, 3-4 out of 5 weeks. And this kid who can't hold up his own head yet because he doesn't have the strength can receive communion without any issue. It's because his parents prioritized him being in church. Yeah, he's going to run around when he gets legs on, just like mine do. I'm purposely not using my kids because no one cares what the priest says about his kids because they're the priest's kids. This is an example of a family that has everything going against them based on what you would think about a very pious family. I really don't mean to degrade them in that way, but if you look at it from the outside, it's not a religiously homogeneous marriage. They didn't come to church. I didn't see them from the time of their wedding until the time they had their child. And then now they're here. I mean, there was a year and a half, 2 years of zero church attendance, but in the 6 months, not even in the 3 months from the baptism, they've been here and their son already knows. So children's presence within the Divine Liturgy is essential for them. If you kids not here until they can handle it, they're never going to be able to handle it. If they're 7 years old on the first time, they sit through an entire, and I literally mean this, because if they've never sat through it, they're going to be sitting through it. If it's 7 years before they have the first experience of the Divine Liturgy, they're not going to make it. But if they're here every Sunday, or more often than not, by the time they're 7 years old, they're gonna get it. So now we're kind of moving out of the art and architecture phase into Panagiotis, fireside chats. But I do want to thank you for being with us.